We're in the book of Esther for just a little bit. We won't spend too much time there this morning, so we have time for communion. Now, 2 books in the Bible named after women, and we covered one already, Ruth, and now we get Esther. It's the last of the historical books, and next we'll get the poetical books. There's 5 of those: Job, Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. And then we'll get into the major prophets. There's 5 of those. And then we'll get into the minor prophets, and there's 12 of those. Then we'll finish up the Old Testament. Remember, 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. The way I always remembered that when I was first learning, 3 times 9 equals 27. Now, if you know your multiplication tables, that works. But anyhow, that was just a thing. But anyhow, we're working our way through the last one. And as we do those, I've been going through those books again to help you get them in your mindset. So when I say Malachi, you're going to go, what? Of course, we know Malachi is not too bad to find because it's the last one of the Old Testament book. So you can find it right in front of Matthew. But, folks don't have a grasp of the books in the Bible. Lots of questions were asked, what are the epistles? And one person said, well, that's the wives of the apostles. But that's not what it is. The Gospels there, and we got the 4 Gospels, and we'll look at the New Testament. But those categories are not really just they're trying to help you out a little bit. It's tracing the history of the nation of Israel. We did the Pentateuch. Remember, that's 5 books: in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then we jumped into the historical books. We started with Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. So that's where we're at. And so that helps you, and it also helps me. We see in the book of Esther, we see God's hand of providence working, what I'm going to call God sightings. But guess what? His name's not mentioned. His name's not mentioned in the whole book. And but you know what? Every day you and I live, we can see God's hand working, even though no one says anything that it's God. We know it. We see it. We experience it. God's sovereignly working out what we call providence, this wonderful plan that He started at creation and is going to finish at the consummation. There is one day when we're into eternal glory forever and ever and ever. But God's hand's at work in your life and in my lives, and you can see it there. And we often think of God's sovereignty on a grand scale, the sweeping act of creation. That's pretty awesome. Every time I read the creation story, it's pretty awesome that God spoke these things into existence and everything works perfectly. It wasn't some big bang. It was a big God who spoke, and it happened. And then the controlling and shaping of history, how God took a one family, Abraham, and built a nation that still exists, and who God's still protecting, and who God is still using, the nation of Israel. No one will wipe out the nation of Israel. I'm going to tell you that right here. I don't care who it is. They'll never wipe out, because that's God's chosen people. And God's not done with them yet, just like He's not done with you yet. And Frederick Buechner, though, tells us that we also experience God's sovereignty in smaller, more subtle ways. He says, I think of a person I haven't seen or thought of for years, and then minutes later I see her crossing the street. I turn on the radio to hear a voice reading the biblical story of Jael, which is the story that I have spent the morning writing about. A car passes me on the road, and its license plates consist of my wife's and my initials side by side. Is that coincidence, or is that a God thing? And you always ask the question. When you tell people stories like that, their usual reaction is to laugh. One wonders why. I believe that people laugh at coincidence as a way of relegating it to the realm of the absurd. See, I don't think anything happens by accident. I think everything happens by the hand of God. There's a purpose for everything that happens in our life. Nothing happens by accident. And there's no such thing as luck, really. I'm sorry if you're Irish. Therefore, not having to take seriously the possibility that there is a lot more going on in our lives than we know or we care about. There's a lot going on, folks, that we don't know, and some folks don't want to know. Who can say what it is that's going on? But I suspect that part of it, anyway, is that every once in a while we hear a whisper from the wings of heaven that goes something like this: you've turned up in the right place at the right time. You're doing fine. Don't even think that you've been forgotten. And God allows some things there to let you know that He's still working on you. He still loves you, and He still wants to be part of your life. And God has certainly not forgotten His exiled people. Remember, they were in Babylon for 70 years, and they've been brought back. And remember, that first wave came under Zerubbabel. You name your kids all that, right? Zerubbabel. And then the second phase came through Ezra, as we looked at that book. And Ezra was a scribe, and he was concerned with the building of the temple and the spiritual walk, Zerubbabel and Ezra. And then came, remember, Nehemiah, the wall builder. He's a construction man. I can relate with that. And he built back the walls out of rubble. That's a God thing. Because remember, the enemy says, you can't build a wall out of that. He says, there's no way possible. Even a fox can knock it down. And then next thing you know, we got choirs going around the top of it singing praise and glory to God, because that was a God thing. But what about those, for one reason or another, stayed back? Remember, only 50,000 came. They figured there was 2 to 3 million Jewish folks. 50,000 came the first one, 1,800 the second, and even a smaller group the third. And what about those folks that stayed back? Well, that's what we're going to find out in the book of Esther. Between that first one under Zerubbabel and Ezra, and then before Nehemiah, we get the book of Esther taking place. So you kind of see what's going on back in Persia, Mede-Persia. You know, the Bible tells us we deal with the groups of this. First was the Babylonians. That's old Nebuchadnezzar. And then we get the Medes and the Persians, which we heard about Cyrus, and he's the one that gave the decree to go back. And then the Bible says the next one in line will be what? Greece. And we'll hear a little bit about that. And then after Greece falls, guess who takes over? Rome. And that's where we're at today. Rome still has an effect upon everything you do almost in this world today. Rome never fell by battle. They just kind of broke apart from within. And the Bible says that someday it's going to be reunited in a 10-nation confederation. And we'll pick up that as we go through the book of Daniel and we look at those things. That's kind of a little history there. And so we see that they're still not outside His care, as the divine coincidences and the drama of Esther show that they're still safe in the palm of His hand. And God's going to protect His nation even though we have an enemy that wants to destroy them. We still have an enemy who wants to destroy them. He's still working anti-Semitic things all over the world today, right here in our home areas and all those things. And he hates God's people. He's working not only on the nation of Israel, he's working on the church. He would love to see the church destroyed. He's breaking down the family unit. And he's looking to destroy those things that God has put in place. But we see God working in the book of Esther. A little about the players. Before the players take stage, a little background. Again, I told you the dramatic events recorded in Esther most likely took place between the exile's first return under Zerubbabel and the second by Ezra. The Persian king Xerxes I was ruling at the time. It's about 486 to 465 BC, if you're in that. And his name in Hebrew is Ahasuerus. So you'll see those two names used, Xerxes and Ahasuerus. Esther's name, and most folks, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if you ask them their Hebrew names, you wouldn't know what it is. Esther's real name is what? Hadassah. And that's in chapter 2, verse 7. And chapter 2, verse 7, it says, "And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah," which means myrtle. Does anybody know what myrtle is? I didn't. Huh? It's a plant flower. I didn't know much about it, so I looked it up. It's an evergreen tree with dark, glossy leaves and white flowers. The leaves, flowers, and berries were used for perfumes, also for seasoning for food. The myrtle tree had religious significance for the Hebrews. You can check that out in Zechariah 1, 8 through 11, and was a symbol of peace and joy. But that's what Hadassah's name meant in the Hebrew. And then her name, the name Esther means star. And Esther is kind of the star of the book. And you'll see as I named this, for such a time as this. See, I told you I don't believe in coincidences, but God has you where you're at, where you're working, where you're living, who you're with, what church you're in, for such a time as this. God has something up his sleeve for you. And he's wanting to use you, and he's got you just at this place and time for some reason. And you're going to have to talk to him about what that reason is. But that's what's going to happen here as we see it take place. And she's a beautiful woman. She's a courageous woman. And though the author of Esther remains obscure, we don't know who wrote it. His dramatic devices leave a clear and lasting message. And these two guys, Dillard and Yamachi, wrote about the thing that I already shared you. An outstanding feature of this book, one that has given rise to considerable discussion, even if this book should be included in the Bible, is the complete absence of any explicit references to God, worship, prayer, or sacrifice. Now, how's that? But that's what's there. The secularity has produced many detractors who have judged the book to be of little religious value. However, it appears that the author has deliberately refrained from mentioning God or any religious activity as a literary device to heighten the fact that God, who controls and directs all the seemingly insignificant coincidences that make up the plot and issue and deliverance for the Jews, God's sovereign rule is assumed at every point, an assumption made it all the more effectively by the total absence of reference to him. Otherwise, even when he's not mentioned, guess what? He's still at work. You see his hand. Now, I don't know what happened to the little guy. I guess Linda took him down. But I've seen people having new babies, and I know we got a proud grandma up here. But when you see that little baby, you see that providential hand of God. I don't know what he has planned for that little one, but it's amazing. And some of those little ones come unexpected. Some come through situations that are not good. But God's hand of providence brings that little one into a life for a purpose and a reason. Just as he's brought you here to this church for a purpose and a reason, he wants to use you. Here's the characters. We have King Ahasuerus, as I already did. He's Xerxes the First, king of Persia. The Medes and the Persian, but as you study that out in Daniel, you'll see that Persia became the stronger of the two groups. Queen Vashti, short part. Seems to be a very beautiful woman. She's queen. She's married to King Ahasuerus, soon to be ex-wife of King Ahasuerus. Yet see, even God can use things like that to bring about his purpose. Mordecai, an exiled Jew living in Persia. For some reason, Mordecai decided he's not going back home and rebuild everything. He stayed there. He's Esther's older cousin and guardian, because Esther has lost her parents. Esther is Mordecai's beautiful ward, soon to be wife of Ahasuerus. So this is another love story. Something about the women thing. Ruth was a love story, and now we get Esther and we get another love story in there. I don't know if that's true or not, but anyhow, it's great. I love this book. And then of course, if you have good guys, you got to have what? A bad guy. And Haman is the bad guy. He's anti-Semitic, he's arrogant, and he has a plot with the king to destroy not just one Jew, but all the Jews. He messed up. He should have never done that, and God will deal with him. As the lights dim and the curtains rise, we find ourselves at the palace in Susa in chapter 1. And we won't get much farther than that in just a minute here, but it's the third year of Ahasuerus' reign, or Xerxes' reign, depends on what you want to call him. And he's decided he's doing a good job. He's going to have a banquet. 6 months long. Look at chapter 1, verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Man, this guy had a kingdom. He thinks he's ruler of the world. Guess what? He is. And it says, in those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan or Susa, depends on what translation you have, the citadel, that in the third year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles, the princes of the provinces being before him. So all the important people are here. All the senators and the congressmen and all the folks from all the countries, and they're all here. And they're going to have a party. And then verse 4 says, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom, he likes to strut his stuff. He wants you to know that he's got money and he's got power and he's got prestige. He's got beautiful women, all those things. He's going to let you know. And of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. That's 6 months. Remember, in the Jewish calendar, there's 30 days. That's every month's the same. It's not like our calendar. They're just 30 days in every month. And it says, when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days. So first he has a feast, and they got this big banquet for 6 months. And not wanting anyone to be left out, he's going to extend it 7 more days, invite everybody in. He says, come on in. He says, we're going to have us a drunken party. He says, the kegs are ready. The wine is ready. Come on in. And that's what happens there in verse 5. And he says, for all the people who were present in Shushan, that's the capital, that's their winter spot. They didn't stay there in the summer. They stayed there in the winter, the king did. From great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So we got everyone coming in. The wine's flowing freely. It says in verse 7, and they served drinks in golden vessels. Pretty important how they brought out the finest china. Each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance. Otherwise, eat, drink, and what? Be merry. Doesn't sound a whole lot different than today. A lot of that going on. I saw that the governor of, or maybe it's the mayor of New York City, anyhow, he was having a meal. $10,000 a plate. Did you all sign up? Nah, I can't quite afford that. I'm doing really good at $10 a plate. And well, maybe a little more than that. It's getting pretty hard to get much for $10 anymore. And I should go to McDonald's, and that's really stretching. If you order for 2, you won't get it for that price. But anyhow, it says, according to the generosity of the king, in accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. Everyone's drinking. Guess what happens when everyone drinks? Yeah, verse 10. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. Isn't that nice? He's merry with wine. He's drunk. He's boozed up. And he decides, he's sitting there with all these buddies, and he decides, guess what? I have a beautiful wife. She's having a banquet for the ladies now, a smaller one than he's having. And he says, I have a beautiful wife, and I'm going to get her to come in and parade herself around in front of everybody so they can look at her. Okay. He said, go tell her, verse 11, Queen Vashti, she has a short part, the king, wearing her royal crown in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. He forgot one thing. She doesn't want to be paraded around in front of a bunch of drunks. But, verse 12, I always like the but verses. Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious and his anger burned within him. He's not happy. He says, listen to me, woman. When I tell you to do something, I am what? I'm king around here. My word goes. Wow. I think she was probably pretty smart myself. I don't know of a woman who want to be paraded around in front of a bunch of drunks. And so he's not so merry. He's mad. He's angry. And so he decides, I got to do something about this. So he asks his wise men some counsel. And in the rest of the chapters there, it says in verse 22, actually in verse 20, the guys get together and said, you got to get rid of her. Because what she's doing is going to cause all the women in this place to rebel. And they're no longer going to do what their husband tells them. That's what it says. And it says in verse 20, when the king's decree which he will make is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. If you'd read the verses before that, you'd have heard where they were concerned about that. Then he sent letters to all, verse 22, the king's provinces, to each province, to its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house. So he's going to get rid of the queen, going to send out a proclamation. Listen, women, you do what your husband tells you. I'm not touching that one. I'm not touching that one. But the Bible does say this, what? The husband is the head of the home. But in nowhere does it tell him that he is king and lord of his wife. He has a lord and he has a king. And he's treated his wife as Christ loved the church. And I believe that if a woman will submit to her part as a wife, as a husband loves his wife as a man should. And so if your husband asks you to parade around in front of a bunch of drunks, you have my permission to tell him no. Don't hurt him too bad. We'll get ready for scene 2 next time together as we see how he deals with this whole situation. But you know what? You just saw a God sighting. Here's a man who's in control, he thinks, of everything. But he really isn't. He's just a pawn. And God's using him, and he uses even his drunkenness to put in position his wonderful plan. And we'll see him get rid of Vashti. But after a few, maybe a couple years alone, he says, man, I miss that woman. Isn't that the way it is? You always miss it after you lose it. And he says, man, I miss that woman. So he asks them what they're going to do, and then we'll see a beauty pageant. We're going to see a beauty pageant, and guess who's the prettiest one of them all? Esther. Hadassah. Esther. And we'll see that as how that plays out into God's plan. See God's hand in just the littlest things, and how God will work this all out. And guess who? And then Mordecai, the Jew, will be exalted to the second place, just as Daniel was. And remember another guy in the Old Testament that got in trouble with a woman? Joseph. David, yeah, but Joseph, David was already there. Joseph got in trouble. Remember, the wife says, hey, Joseph, would you lay with me? Because remember, Joseph was a hunk. And he was built. He was good looking. Man, and that woman chased him like fleas on a dog's back. And she just wanted to jump on him. But he says, no way. Remember Joseph? He says, I could not do that against the Lord. And I could not do that against the king, the Pharaoh. He said, I'm second in charge here. Everything is under my control. That's what God does. He takes a nobody and makes them a somebody, right? When they fit into God's plan. And he's going to do that. That's God's sightings. And he's wanting to do that in your life. And now